This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for another edition of Nizzanotes, a weekly vlog series where I talk about limited magic. And in today's video, we're going to be sort of wrapping up Innistrad Midnight Hunt. It's pretty much over as a format. By the time this video is going up, previews will have begun for Crimson Vow. We'll start to be talking about what's going on there with those previews and things like that. And so we're not going to be nearly as interested in this set as it'll sort of be old news once preview season begins. So this will really be our last video about Innistrad Midnight Hunt, and it's sort of a review of Midnight Hunt. Not a review in the sense that I'm grading all the cards in it like I do with my set reviews, but a review in the sense that I'm talking about how good I think the format was, where it ranks among formats, and stuff like that. So I'm going to talk about some positive points, some negative points, and then talk about where I see this limited format fitting in the hierarchy of limited formats. So some positive points. I think there were some very interesting archetypes in the format. I think Blue-Black especially was a really neat take on like zombie tribal, just because the zombie token situation with the decay zombie tokens really made for a different kind of zombie deck. You're not just playing a bunch of zombie creatures, and in fact, there aren't very many actual zombie payoffs in the set. There are a few, like Blade Stitch Scob and stuff like that, but mostly the payoffs are about having a bunch of creatures in play or sacrificing them or utilizing them. And so the blue-black deck was really dynamic and interesting in a way we haven't really seen a zombie deck be before. Another archetype, probably my favorite one in the format, the one that I ended up enjoying the most, was blue-green. Blue-green doesn't normally get to be a self-mill graveyard deck in most formats. I feel like the last time that happened was like Odyssey, and that's a very long time ago. And so it was pretty cool to have it be this self-mill deck. I really enjoyed playing with the farmer who mills 4 cards. That card just gave you so much value, and it was a fun, grindy deck for the most part. And I thought those decks were really interesting. Even the take on vampires, black-red, was sort of an interesting take. It wasn't just tribal. It was also, has your opponent been hurt this turn? If so, you get an extra effect. And in general, I think the archetypes are well-designed and interesting for the most part. And I think that adds a lot of replay value to the set because those decks are so fun to play. Even green-white, Coven being a thing, sure it was a go wide deck, but Coven I think was an interesting, fun mechanic for limited, where, you had to make decisions in the draft where you were diversifying your power and things like that, and then in the games you had to make decisions too. So I think most of the archetypes, my point is, are very interesting and felt fresh for the most part. They didn't all, of course, there's 10 of them. They're not all going to be original and interesting. But I think there were enough of them that it was a lot of fun. I also think the set was relatively balanced. When I get to the cons section here, after talking about the positive points, I'll talk about one area where that's not really true. But generally speaking, the set was balanced, especially after we had Forgotten Realms, a format that had huge balance issues. This format didn't. It wasn't a fast or slow format, really. It was somewhere in the middle. And I think that's kind of ideal because it means all strategies can be viable if you get the right deck. Sometimes we have formats that are really fast and you really can't afford to play a lot of cards that would be good in most limited formats that don't add to the board. And, in this format, you do need to be adding to the board significantly for the most part, but very grindy, slow decks are a real thing. Like the blue-green deck can be this slow, grindy thing. The blue-black deck can be slower too. And that was viable. As were aggro strategies. You weren't completely screwed if you were the person playing an aggro deck because your opponent would just be able to stop the onslaught and, just sort of easily defeat you in the late game. Decks of both strategies were viable. There were, different matchups depending on what deck you were playing. Stuff like that. I thought all of that made this a good format. Any format where you're not forced into either really aggressive decks or really grindy decks is good, and I think that was a good thing here. I also liked that the archetypes, for some of them anyway, there was some interesting diversity. A lot of times if there are different color pairs and stuff, and there's just really one deck to be had. But there was a lot of diversity, especially with three color pairs that I want to look at. And I think the fact that these three color pairs could be significantly different decks, even though it's the same color pair, I think that also adds to sort of replay value and making the format interesting. One of those is black red. That's supposed to be like a vampire aggro deck, and it often was, but it could also be a spell deck. And that was a cool thing to have going on. In black and red, you end up with a lot of good spells, and there are spell payoffs like Ardent Elementalist, rebuying your powerful spells. So basically, just within red-black, you could be a more aggressive vampire deck and sort of a mid-rangey to controlling red-black spell deck. And that was really interesting. Similarly, with blue-green, both versions of the deck are graveyard decks, but one of them is like this ramp deck that's planning on doing stuff with Rise of the Ants, and that's how they're going to win the game, by stabilizing, by casting, and then recasting Rise of the Ants. But the other one is more aggressive, and it was more about Winterthorn Blessing and playing out good 2-drops and 3-drops, and, getting 2 bodies out of cards with Disturb that are really efficient, and stuff like that. And that felt like a way different deck. When you're using Winterthorn Blessing to win the game and you have like 15 lands in your deck and the highest your curve goes is like 3, it's way different from a Rise of the Ants type blue-green deck. And I thought that was pretty cool that both were pretty viable. Similarly, blue-red had 2 different things going on. It could be, both of them are spell decks, but one of them was a more aggressive spell deck where you use the 2-mana 1/3 Devil and lots of cheap spells and combat tricks to really make your opponent's life difficult. And the other one was a grindier deck where you want to play Harness the Storm, and that's how you're going to win the game, by playing all of these instants and sorceries and getting a big trampler and then flashing it back. And those are 2 different decks. Even though the deck was still about spells, one of them wanted to end the game quickly. The other one was perfectly happy making the game go long. So, in terms of archetypes, those are the good things about the archetypes. Another thing I really liked about the set was the flavor in general. I really like Halloween and fall, so I thought all of the stuff we had going on in this set was really cool for festive reasons. But also I think it was a well-designed set flavor-wise, because I'm not someone who follows the lore a ton, but I follow it very loosely, and I was still able to sort of follow the story of this festival being held to try to end this endless night, and then werewolves trying to oppose the end of this festival. And I thought that was well conveyed. I thought Coven flavorfully was a good mechanic for this festival and conveying what the festival was, and you needed a certain number of people or the festival wasn't going to work, and stuff like that. So I thought that was a cool design. And yeah, so, I think this was a pretty good format. Like I said, I'll put it within the hierarchy of where I think it fits at the end of this video. But it's definitely a format that, if it's in a flashback format, especially in the fall, in October, like next year, I think I'll definitely be playing it. And that's a good sign. There are other limited formats where you get to the end and you're like, I think I'm done with this format. Full stop, right? And I don't think this was one of those. So that is good news about the format, and it has to do with these archetypes and them being fun, and then the sort of 2 different decks that some of them have within them. It's not all good though. Let's move now to the negative points. So like I said, the set is fairly balanced. Almost every format ever, it's going to have a color that's usually worse, and it's going to have a color pair or 2 that are worse. But I think the chasm between the best and the worst decks in this format was too wide. Blue-black especially was just a powerhouse of a deck. You could just draft a deck of all commons that could just overpower almost everything else. I was talking about how great all that zombie synergy is and makes it interesting, and it does, but it also makes the deck really powerful. They just tacked on zombie tokens on cards that would already be playable, and then you have all of this extra value you can get out of the tokens, sacking them, tapping them, etc. So that deck just ended up being probably too good. I'd like to see a couple cards like Siege Zombie moved up to an uncommon or something. I think would make a big difference in, balancing that deck a little bit. Yeah, so that deck was too good. Meanwhile, red-green, which, flavor-wise, I was saying the flavor's good, but this makes no sense. The werewolves in this set were the worst deck in Limited. And this had to do with, sort of the opposite problem. All the best cards were at uncommon, and the common, payoffs for doing werewolf stuff were not good at all. And so that deck ended up being significantly worse And to a lesser extent, I think black-green ended up being significantly worse too. And so, ideally, I think, you have these decks that are very close to each other, at least, even when there's always going to be a 10th best archetype. But the gap between 9 and 10 and the rest of the decks, and then the gap between number 1 and the rest of the decks, ended up being a little bit too big. And that made for some problems of balance overall in the format. So that wasn't great. That's the format's, I think, biggest weakness is basically red, green, and black, green being pretty bad compared to the other archetypes. And, I talked about this when I talked about, the archetypes when I ranked them a couple weeks ago. That doesn't mean those decks are unplayable. It's just that for those decks to work out, you are relying on getting some pretty key cards that you just don't, the other decks will come together a lot more easily, is the point. Another negative point, and this one's not about like how the set was designed exactly. It's about Arena. The day and night animations were really underwhelming. Like when I saw that mechanic debut, I thought they were going to like have the sun and the moon switching places like on the board, and you could just see it all the time. And I think that would have also just done a way better job of helping convey its nighttime or daytime than the way the board looks as it does, in addition to just being visually better instead of just this like sun rising thing that happens at the end of the turn. So yeah, that one's sort of nitpicky, but it is a thing that I was kind of underwhelmed by in this format. The main thing though, main negative, red, green, and black, green being not very good and blue black being too good. So to in this video, to finish things up talking about this format, where does this rank? Well, I have things divided into tiers that I sort of put together for this video. And I only ranked Arena era formats, so I'm not going all the way back to all the formats ever, but I think this still gives you a good idea of where I see the set. So one of these days, I'll sort of do a format review of each of these, probably. We'll get there. And so I'll go into more detail about what makes these sets good or bad. But for now, I'll just show you where I have them and briefly, talk about what makes a format great, etc. So the first tier is some of the greatest formats ever. I think the best format ever on Arena is Dominaria. And I think the next best is Throne of Eldraine. Then we have Kaldheim. Then we have Strixhaven. So two pretty recent sets there. And these four sets are great because they have almost unlimited replay value. The draft decisions and in-game decisions are interesting and dynamic, and things are just really fun and well-designed. Archetypes are relatively well-balanced. There's not this problem we've seen with a couple of recent sets where there's a pretty big problem of balance. And I think all those sets were really successful and really the four best ones we've ever seen on Arena. After that, I have good formats. These are formats where things are, for the most part, fun, but there might be one or two problems that make the format less great than the ones we just mentioned. Here I have things like Theros Beyond Death, Zendikar Rising, War of the Spark, Guilds of Ravnica, and Ravnica Allegiance. These are all formats that were a lot of fun, but they were not great. They weren't, they had problems of balance. They had problems of some archetypes being too good, too bad, sort of like what we just talked about with Midnight Hunt. And then there's the third tier, which is mediocre formats I'll probably never, ever, ever play again even if they're posted as a flashback draft. And for me, those are Ikoria and Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. That's right, I think Forgotten Realms is the worst limited format of the Arena era of these 12 we have here. So that tells you something. And Ikoria as well. And if you played either of those formats, there were massive balance issues that really kind of took away from the fun. The funny thing about both of these formats for me is that I think they weren't very much fun, but my win percentage in both of them was higher than the others, so that's kind of interesting. So winning isn't everything, I guess, is what I'm saying, because neither of those formats were great, and I have no interest in ever replaying them. Like I said, someday maybe I'll go into more depth about why I think these are good and bad. The main answer is replay value, balance. Those are the main things. So where does this fit? Well, I think it slots into the second tier, and it's pretty high in the second tier. I think it goes in right before Theros Beyond Death. So, I think this is number 6, basically, within these 12 formats right in the middle. I think it was a good format. It wasn't a great one, but it is one I would be happy to replay, in the future, and one that, for the most part, I'll have fond memories of the interesting and engaging archetypes that we had access to in the format. So yeah, that's my review of this set of Midnight Hunt. For the next couple of weekends, we'll be between formats basically. And I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to do yet. I may do some videos sort of speculating on archetypes depending on what we've seen so far come out of Crimson Vow. And I may also do some more general videos about Limited, general topics where we can just talk about Limited more broadly instead of format-specific ones. But we'll see. It sort of depends on what cards are previewed, if there's anything I really want to talk about within the new set, or if I just want to talk about Limited more generally. Anyway, that does it for this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future editions of Nizzanotes and an upcoming Crimson Vow set review and a whole bunch of other content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can by going to Patreon. Thanks for watching.